morning, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting Paul Blustein, who's here to discuss his new book, King Dollar, The Past and Future of the World's Dominant Currency. Paul's been writing about economic issues for a long time, more than 4 decades, actually. Early on, he wrote for Forbes for 4 years, then moved to the Wall Street Journal for 8 years. And after that, he joined the Washington Post, where he stayed 19 years, including a 5-year stint based in Tokyo. Paul and I overlapped at the Post, and I can attest to his reputation as a very accomplished journalist. He was really well respected at the paper. He's also the author of 6 previous books chronicling international financial crises. You name the crises, he's probably written a book about it, and major developments in globalization and trade. He began work on King Dollar back in 2020, but its publication now amidst the economic upheaval resulting from Donald Trump's sanctions and other destabilizing measures couldn't be more timely. Trump's coercive actions have prompted renewed talk of foreign nations in an effort to insulate themselves, finding ways to disengage from an international system long dominated by the U.S. dollar. Meanwhile, cryptocurrency enthusiasts keep promoting the idea that Bitcoin or some other blockchain-based monetary units could ultimately overtake the dollar as the international standard. Paul provides a lot of valuable context in his book for understanding how the dollar became the world's dominant currency and how, despite periodic predictions stretching back decades that it will lose this status, it's remained on top. In fact, Paul argues the dollar's preeminence is practically unshakable, although he does caveat this with the phrase, barring catastrophic missteps by the U.S. government. And he looks at what some of those missteps could be. And mind you, he was writing this before Trump got elected and the current craziness began. A basic theme of the book comes from Spider-Man, you know, that great philosopher of world affairs. And it's this, that with great power comes great responsibility. So Paul addresses how the dollar's primacy places a disproportionate obligation on the United States to foster and preserve global financial responsibility. And he warns against excessive exploitation of sanctions by the United States, saying they could boomerang and lead to economic damage domestically, and the strengthening of alternative financial channels internationally. And on the subject of crypto, he examines the challenges posed by the rise of digital assets and the question of whether the Fed should issue its own digital currency. So these are really important questions, important issues. And Paul writes about all this not only with the authority that comes from having covered these issues for years, but also with the clarity and the liveliness that he honed during a distinguished career as a journalist. So please join me in welcoming Paul Blustein.
Thanks very much, Brad. I've been so honored to be a colleague of Brad's at the Washington Post and his wife, Lisa Muscatine, the co-owners of this store. I mean, I was honored enough to have been their colleague as journalists together, and all the more so because they're sustaining this very important Washington institution, expanding it. It's not only surviving, it's thriving. So thank you, Brad, and thank you to Politics and Prose and other staff people who've helped with the launch of this book. And it's really nice to see, I really thank you all also for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. 2 people who couldn't come because it's their bedtime out in Bethesda, Maryland, at my daughter's and son-in-law's house. These are 2 people to whom the book is dedicated. I really enjoy telling people this dedication. I can't resist telling you too. The dedication is to my grandchildren, whom I will always love unconditionally, even if they grow up to like crypto. Okay, I'm glad you like it. And that may make you think that the book is, mostly about crypto, but it's not. I mean, a fair amount of it is, but a lot of it is about some of the things that Brad was mentioning about the dollar's primacy in the international system, the fact that it has this sort of special and unique status as the currency, much more than any other, much more than the euro or the Chinese renminbi or the Japanese yen, Swiss franc, any of these other major currencies, as the currency that's used in international commerce, and the tremendous leverage that gives the U.S. government in foreign policy, because as I'm sure I'm not telling most of you, and it's something you don't know already, that it can sever those, maybe an individual or a company or a bank or even a whole country, sever their access to the dollar-based system. So I've been talking a lot about those geopolitical sorts of issues at other events, at think tanks, and on wonky podcasts and that kind of thing. And I'm happy to talk about those issues in the Q&A period, because I'm not going to take up the whole hour just blathering. But for this audience, and in this venue, I thought I'd talk about one of my favorite parts of the book, where I talk about what makes a dollar a dollar. Now that you might think, well, I know what makes a dollar, but there's so much confusion about, and frankly BS about this issue. If you spend a lot of time on Twitter, as I insist on continuing to call it, if you spend as much time on that as I do on social media, following. I have to do this for my research, following the crypto bros. You'll often see them say things like, well, okay, Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. That's the criticism, but the dollar isn't backed by anything either. We went off the gold standard, and so there's nothing backing the dollar. So the dollar is, you call Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme. Well, the dollar is a Ponzi scheme, or the dollar is a meme coin. I mean, really, honestly, I've seen, lots of arguments like this. And a lot of this is based on an argument that sounds sort of intuitively appealing, which is that money is just a social construct. It's a shared fiction. And the value depends on the willingness of people to accept it and the expectation that other people will accept it in the future. Otherwise, what value would it have? And at various times in history, items such as shells and beads and animal skins have served as money. And human beings have this remarkable capacity in extreme circumstances for kind of creating money-like instruments. So, a classic example that's often cited in textbooks is, in prisoner of war camps, people use cigarettes, right, as a way of obtaining things of value. So, from those examples, people sometimes draw the conclusion, they often do, that money doesn't require the involvement of the state, of government, and it certainly doesn't require state monopoly over issuance of money. And now that we have this technology that gives us all these fantastic, whizzy, cool ways of transmitting value, from using our phones, just zipping money from one phone to another. Well, why should the U.S. dollar? Why should state-issued money play any role at all? Why should dollars be more worthy of serving as money than software code that's been cleverly designed by computer engineers? So that's what you see quite often on social media, and maybe some of you have heard this. Many of you like me, your hair has turned gray. You may hear this from maybe from your children, or God help you, your grandchildren, or you've been at a dinner party where some boor has droned on and on about the wonders of some cryptocurrency or other, and has said, well, there's nothing backing the dollar either, right? So in the next 15 minutes or so, I want to take you through this part of this section of my book. It's right in the first chapter, where I say this is really my favorite part. When all authors fall in love with their own writing, right? But when I want to look over my book, And so, what part do I want to read? Oh, I want to read that section where what makes a dollar a dollar. I really love this part of the book, and I hope that by the time I'm finished, you'll understand why I enjoy it so much. And so I'm going to start with Kublai Khan. Yes, the 13th century Chinese emperor. Okay. In his realm, he was very innovative in monetary affairs. Looking back on it, there was a kind of currency that his regime issued. It was called Chow. It was paper currency. It wasn't backed by any precious metals or commodities, and yet people accepted it. They were willing to use it as money. Now, why? Well, Marco Polo, when he made his, when he went to Cathay and was dazzled by the wonders of the Khan's, empire, one of the things that he was really amazed by was this currency, which nothing like that existed in Europe. And he said the reason people accepted this currency, which seemed to have no value, was that any person refusing chow would do so, quote, at the peril of his life, unquote, okay? Well, if you studied economics, or even if you haven't, you may recognize this concept is fiat currency. That's currency where the value stems purely from government authority, government fiat, rather than some intrinsic value where you can, go trade it in for gold or some other precious, some tangible commodity, right? Now, Kublai Khan was applying this principle of fiat currency with a very draconian twist. I mean, but anyway, this was an interesting. This gives you a real idea of what it was probably the earliest example of fiat currency. And the dollar is a fiat currency. It lost the last vestiges of its linkage to gold in 1971 during the Nixon administration. Now, of course, you don't get threatened with execution or bodily harm for refusing to accept the dollar. But the U.S. government does play some crucial roles in instilling public confidence in the dollar. The state, plays some crucial roles, and some of these will have occurred to you if you've given any thought to this question. But some of them do require a bit of expertise in the workings of the monetary system. So I'm going to walk through those, and I hope by the time we finish, you'll see why I think it's important to understand, what makes a dollar a dollar. So the most obvious one is the power to tax, right? So one of the reasons why we're confident in accepting dollars and using dollars and knowing that others will accept it is because if, the IRS insists on being paid in dollars, and if you don't pay your taxes, they'll go after you. So we're comfortable accepting dollars because we know that other people will find it useful too. Partly for that. But that's not really it's far from the whole story. So another is the principle of legal tender. Like if you take a dollar bill out of your wallet and look at it, you'll see, in small type, you probably notice it says this bill is legal tender for all purposes, public and valid for all purposes, public. I can't remember what the exact wording is, but you know what I'm talking about. And legal tender means that dollars can be used in satisfaction of obligations, both paying the government, but also private contracts. So if you use the dollar to make the payment in a contract, a court will deem it fulfilled. That's not, the same is not true if you say, well, I'll give you gold or I'll give you Bitcoin or some other thing, animal skins, I don't know. No matter how valuable you say they are, legal tender is the dollar, okay? But beyond that, the state does a lot more. So for us to have confidence in our dollar, we need to know that we need to be reasonably certain that our dollars will retain purchasing power over time. And that's the responsibility of the Federal Reserve, which is mandated by law to keep the overall price level stable. And the way it does that, even if you're just a casual reader of the financial pages, you know that what the Fed does is when the economy is running really hot and there's too much demand and too much money chasing too few goods, And so which is what leads to prices going up. So the Fed then will raise interest rates to try to, cool things down. There's not as much borrowing and so forth, and it will keep the price level from rising too fast and hopefully bring it back down. And the Fed also, if the economy is sluggish, it'll lower interest rates, try to encourage more lending and borrowing and more economic activity to try to boost the economy back to life. And this is a very difficult task that the Fed has. I mean, it's really hard to predict, is the economy too hot, too cold? How do we get it just right? It's a very difficult thing. But anyway, that's the Fed's mandate, is to try to control the supply of money and interest rates and to come as close as reasonably possible to maintaining reasonable growth without having a lot of inflation. But beyond that, and those are all things that we've maybe all have heard about. But beyond that, the state does a lot more. It ensures that a dollar is a dollar, regardless of whether a dollar is public money or private money. And I'm guessing that these are terms that many of you are unfamiliar with. So one kind of public money is the thing of what most of us think of as money, the paper currency that we carry around in our wallets. It says Federal Reserve note on the top, right? And that means it is issued by the Federal Reserve. You can't take it to the Fed or the Treasury or any government agency and say, give me gold for this, give me silver, where you can't redeem it for that. But it is recorded on the Fed's balance sheet as a liability. Never mind the accounting. What that kind of means is that it's like an implicit promise by the Federal Reserve to maintain that note's purchasing power, or at least come as close as reasonably possible. Now, most of us don't want to keep our money in the form of public money, cash, right? Because we're worried that it might get stolen. We want to earn interest on it, and we want the convenience of modern payment systems. We want to be able to, have it in the bank for when our credit card bill comes due or whatever. So we deposit most of our money, most of our dollars. Most of us do, in banks, and that's where it becomes private money. If you deposit, you deposit $100. You go to the teller window, you put it in and say, I'm depositing this in my account. That's just a liability of that bank to you. Now, I am, of course, well aware that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guarantees $250,000 of deposits if the bank goes bust. But put that aside for a minute. That's still that $100 is still private money. Okay, it's a liability of that bank to you. It's just a promise by them that they'll give it to you if you demand it back. And the vast majority of dollars that are used for payments in the United States are private money. Now, here's something that really may startle you a bit. It's something that drives the crypto folks really batty. Is that private money can be created by banks kind of out of thin air, like magic. So let's say a bank lends $10 million to a company because the company wants to build a factory. Well, the bank can just credit that company's account with $10 million. Presto chango, that company has $10 million of deposits that it can use to build that factory. So, you can, that is a little disconcerting to think about, but banks are regulated. There are all these laws and rules and regulations and regulatory agencies staffed with people who know how to enforce them. And first of all, a bank has to make good on its deposits. So, maybe that company gets their deposits created out of thin air, but if you go and demand your money out, and you want to take your deposit out. If the bank says, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're out of money," well, the bank gets closed down. Okay, because that's the law. Your deposit is a legal liability of the bank. This is another way in which the state plays a role in the confidence that you have in dollars. And there's another flip side of this, which is for a bank, a loan is an asset. That the $10 million that I just mentioned, as for using the little example that I gave you, it's a promise by that company to repay. It's legally binding, right? Of course, there's a contract that's drawn up, and the company has to repay that $10 million. If they don't, and they have to pay with interest. If they don't, then they may be forced into bankruptcy. Same way as with, if with a mortgage or a car loan, they can repossess your car or foreclose on your house. Now, most loans end happily, but the point is that the dollar is backed by much more than the willingness of others to accept it. It's also backed by rule of law. The state requires contracts to be honored, and courts stand ready to adjudicate disputes. So finally, the dollar gets state backing in one other way, and this is quite wondrous and important. So I'm going to start by explaining something else, going back again in monetary history, not all the way back to the 13th century this time. This time I'm just going to go back to the first half of the 19th century in New York City. At that time, up until about 1853, banks employed porters who used to go on foot through the streets of New York from bank to bank, carrying bags of gold coins, which they would exchange at each bank they went to, depending on which bank owed who, how much money. Okay? You think, really? I mean, that sounds pretty wild, but that's actually what, by the way, this is something that absolutely gobsmacked me when I first learned about it. It was not something that I knew about before I started working on this book. But why would they do that? Well, think about it. When you make a payment, so let's use a happy example. So suppose I'm spending $100 to buy books here at Politics and Prose. Maybe I pay by writing a check. Maybe I'll just tap a debit card on the machine up in the front. And what it may look as if money goes from my account, I happen to bank at Wells Fargo, to Politics and Prose's account. Now, Brad, you don't have to tell us which bank your Politics, but I don't know, just for purposes of illustration, let's say they bank at Chase, okay? So what happens is my bank account goes down by $100. We've all looked at our bank statements, and you see the little debit, right? When you make a payment, and Politics and Prose will go up by $100, right? At their account at Chase. But wait a minute. Chase doesn't just give Politics and Prose $100 out of the goodness of his heart. Wells Fargo has to pay Chase, right? There has to be a payment from bank to bank. And that's what those guys in New York were doing. They were carrying those gold coins through the streets of New York because when customers of one bank made payments to customers of other banks, the banks had to pay each other too. Okay, I hope I'm making sense. And you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, but there aren't guys running through the streets of Washington, D.C. I mean, if I pay $100 for my books at Politics, there isn't going to be some guy, carrying a bag of gold coins from Wells Fargo to Chase. Of course not. Nowadays, banks pay each other with reserves. And this is a special kind of money that only banks use. They aren't shiny like gold. They aren't even tangible like, paper currency. They're just electronic entries that go up and down in accounts that banks have at the Federal Reserve. And all this takes place behind the scenes with electronic entries going up or down. Okay, so in the example I just cited, if I'm paying $100 for my books, my account at Wells Fargo is debited $100. It goes down $100, right? Politics and Prose is credited $100. It goes up by $100. Wells Fargo's account at the Federal Reserve goes down by $100, and Chase's account at the Federal Reserve goes up by $100, okay? So this is why the Fed is called the central bank, because it's the bank that's in the middle of all this, and it's, raising and lowering the accounts, the reserve accounts that all these banks have, and this is the way money is transmitted between banks when customers of their banks, it doesn't have to be individuals like us, it can be big companies, it can be, it can be universities, it can be hedge funds, it can, all these kinds of payments. It's all basically works the same way. Now, the same thing happens, just to make sure you understand the example, same thing happens reverse. Suppose you get money. let's say you get your paycheck. Let's say your paycheck is $5,000 a month. So you see, you're very happy to see, you look at your bank account, oh yeah, okay, my $5,000 paycheck came through, your account has gone up by $5,000, and your employer's account goes down by $5,000, and if your employer, let's say you bank at Wells Fargo like me, your employer banks at Chase, and so Chase's account at the Fed goes down by $5,000, right? And Wells Fargo's account at the Fed goes up by $5,000, okay? So, now remember I said that this is wondrous and cool and kind of amazing. So here's why. All these types of dollars, paper bills, bank deposits, and reserves are interchangeable. You can go to an ATM of your bank and you dip your card in and you enter your PIN and bing, shazam, you've converted private money to public money, right? Let's say your bank needs more cash in its ATMs. The ATMs are running dry, so they send a message to the Fed and they say, we need, $100,000 of cash. And the Fed ships it to them, but the Fed lowers that bank's reserve account by $100,000. And at each step of the way, the dollars are dollars. There's no restriction or loss of value. They're exchangeable at what they call at par, which means $1 equals $1, $100 equals exactly $100. So why is this so important? Well, a central banker who a really brilliant guy, his name is Sir John Cunliffe. He was deputy governor of the Bank of England until quite recently. Gave a speech about this several years ago. And he was speaking about the UK, but his words apply to the US. And I quote them in the book, and I just I'll read them to you here. Sir John says, "It is not clear to me to what extent the general public understand this distinction between public and private money, or even that most of the time they are using private money. The fact that, unlike in some periods of history, we do not at present think much about these things, and that people in the UK have a general confidence in the money they use, regardless of its form and issuer, is, I think, a good thing. It is not an accident. It is due to the credibility of the institutional framework governing money in the UK that tethers private money to the public money issued by the state." Of course, he said it with a much more plummy accent than I have, but anyway. Now, this institutional framework that he talked about, it can be abused, right? In the old days, back in the Kublai Khan and centuries around that time, princes used to debase the coinage, right? They would put less gold or silver in the coins if they wanted to invade a neighboring principality, or if they wanted to, build a castle for their concubine or whatever purpose it was. So they would cheat the public in that way. Today, politicians can twist the arms of central bankers and say, I want you to issue more money. I want you to basically print more money because I want, I have this big expenditure that I want to do, or big tax cut that I want to give to my friends, or whatever it is. And obviously, when central banks do that, the inflation is the result. But the point stands that the fiat currency dollar rests on an edifice that's underpinned by a great deal of state scaffolding, right? It doesn't have to be backed by anything tangible. It doesn't need to be backed by gold. It certainly doesn't need to be backed by Bitcoin. And if we can depend on our government to faithfully perform the functions that I just talked about, and that is no small if, that's what will keep the dollar sound. That was what make the dollar a dollar. That will make it money that we can have confidence in transacting in. So if my book, and I'm not sure, I have my doubts that it's going to make the New York Times bestseller list, but if it helps you, if you're at a dinner party and somebody is droning on in a boorish way about, the dollar, there's no, once we did away with the gold standard years ago, it has no intrinsic value. Bitcoin is worth just as much. Well, then maybe my book will help. I mean, you'll be able to say, well, actually, I have this book, and it's a lot more complicated than you're saying. So can we change the subject? And so if it shuts them up, then my book will have performed a service. And so with that, I'll just say I'm happy to take your questions.
Well, Paul, can I tease out of you some of the other points you make in your book, particularly about this reference to, the dollar will remain dominant, barring some catastrophic missteps by the U.S. government. And are we actually seeing potentially some of those catastrophic missteps at the moment by the use of sanctions and so on?
Quite possibly. In the book, I mentioned some possible ones that occurred to me. Now, I was putting the finishing touches on this book. I think Yale Press said November 25th that's the drop. No more changes after that. So I knew what the election result was. I knew who the Treasury Secretary was, but not much more than that. And so, but I could easily imagine various things. So some of the ones that I came up with was, well, Trump may really coerce the Fed into printing money. He did bash the Fed quite hard in his first term as president, and there were a lot of worries that he was going to undermine the independence of the Fed and really do away with a very important pillar of confidence in the dollar. And so maybe he would go even further. He was there, threatened to fire Jay Powell, the chairman. There was another one was, well, if rule of law is shredded to the point where people see no difference between the impartiality of American courts and Chinese courts, because one of the reasons why the Chinese renminbi is really quite low on the currency totem pole of the dollar, especially compared to the dollar, is that people are worried that Chinese courts, if they have a dispute over their assets, that the friends of the Chinese Communist Party will get favorable treatment. That's one reason why the dollar has the privileged position that it does, because international investors trust rule of law. How much longer are they going to do that? Rule of law is in all kinds of ways. Just today, my God, I was clutching my head seeing some of the stuff that's happening. But will that affect international, investors' perception of whether they can possibly get a fair shake in the courts? That I think we ought to be very concerned about that. Whether it will go that far, I don't know. Another one I came up with was that if tensions between the U.S. and China become so, it gets so bad that the world kind of bifurcates into two blocks, where there's one dominated by the U.S. dollar and one dominated by the Chinese renminbi, well, that would diminish dollar dominance. There were a couple of others I had. J.D. Vance is very close to a guy named Peter Thiel, this big billionaire who hates the fiat money system. If Peter Thiel were to, if J.D. Vance becomes president, or even if he doesn't, Trump has also become quite enamored of crypto. So maybe if they upset the fiat money system, that could do damage. All of these things are real catastrophes. These are real catastrophic missteps, and losing dollar dominance is sort of the least of our worries. Then, okay, so to come to your question, Brad, okay, and then after January 20th, more things. The one that absolutely boggles my mind is the coercion that Trump has been using so far just with tariffs against countries who had, I thought, pretty good reason to think of us as their best friends, Canada being the obvious most, this is really the most egregious case. And I've been saying at some of the other events that I did, some events at think tanks and on wonky podcasts, I've been saying, I hope my book is wrong. I really do. I really hope that Trump doesn't have this extra power to use the power of the dollar to coerce these countries into, coerce Canada into annexation or impoverish, I don't think they'll do it, I don't think the Canadians will be coerced that far, but he may impoverish them by depriving them of access to the dollar. It is a very potent weapon that he has at his command. I wish that my book weren't true. I'm afraid it is. And I'm afraid it's a real inconvenient truth that, that he does have this potent weapon at his command. So I've been, I do think that, he's clearly giving enormous incentives to other big economies to find ways of getting around the dollar system. And the Europeans are suddenly starting to take all kinds of steps to make the euro a more viable competitor to the dollar. The Germans saying, okay, we're not going to have what they call the debt brake. I mean, the sort of constitutional prohibition on deficit spending. And maybe the Europeans will take action that will make their economy more financially unified, which will make it possible for them to, much more possible for them to have a currency that rivals the dollar. I'm really skeptical that they can do it in any kind of hurry. I think it'll be very costly, very difficult, and it will take quite a while. I wish it weren't the case, honestly. You can hang me for treason for saying so, but yeah.
No, that's the most hopeful thing I've heard in a long time.
Oh, well.
You started out talking about sanctions, and everyone is concerned that we're overusing them, that we've sanctioned half the world, and this and that. But what's the alternative? It seems to me we use it not because it's a good weapon, but because the only alternative is combat.
Right. I guess I think the way I look at that is I think, sanctions they're good when they're good. There was a really great, there have been a couple of really good examples of when they've been good because the alternative, as you say, is bloodshed and horrific, and war.
Destruction.
Or just sort of the United States saying, we don't like what you just did and, we condemn you, just words. Sanctions, are a good medium way. And there was when the Obama administration used sanctions to coerce Iran into coming around and accepting limits on its nuclear program and not proceeding with creating, going for a nuclear bomb. That was, that was a good use of sanctions. We all have our opinions about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I would argue there that again military force was, against a nuclear power like Russia. Well, yeah, that wouldn't have been so good, but also just condemning would have seemed really feckless. So I do think sanctions are good. The way I like to think about them, though, there is this argument that if we overuse them, that we will lose the power of the dollar because countries will have more incentive to move away from the dollar-based system.
Correct.
There's a good bit of validity to that, and there's a very good book by a guy named Daniel McDowell at Syracuse University. He did a book called Bucking the Buck. I don't know, maybe you sell it here, Brad. I don't know. And it's a good bit more of a scholarly book than mine. He's a real academic. I'm not. And his argument is, if we overuse these sanctions, there will come a time when we really want to use the dollar for something really big, so we ought to save it up. And my view is, well, there's some validity to that, but on the other hand, if sanctions are a wasting asset, if other countries are going to find ways around, well then, actually, that's kind of a good argument for being aggressive and using them early rather than later, because why wait until they're not effective anymore? So and then the other point is the one that Brad raised about the Spider-Man principle. That's, I think, the best way of thinking about sanctions. We should apply sanctions. They have great power. We should use them responsibly. Whether or not we're going to lose that power. because they hurt people. I mean, they cause economic pain. That's the whole point, right? And usually, the people who are usually hurt the most are the poor and marginalized, and they can really infuriate countries. You know, the U.S. is bullying them, and they get mad, and we, so it hurts our relationship with our allies, and countries can retaliate. They can find other ways of retaliate. They can't, use their currencies to cut us off, but they can retaliate in other ways. So with great power comes great responsibility. That seems to me a better way of thinking about sanctions than, oh gosh, if we overuse them, we'll lose the ability to, it'll become a weaker form of a weaker foreign policy tool.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a long answer to you, but a very good question.
Hi, I had two questions. One, I was wondering if you could talk about modern monetary MMT theory, and how that relates to the dollar. And the second question is, how do you explain the Trump administration's embrace of crypto? It seems like the dollar would kind of fit an America First agenda, a patriotic agenda, a power agenda. How do you explain kind of going against that for this crypto? So MMT and the Trump administration and crypto.
Okay, MMT. I'll confess I'm a little bit. I think what we've learned. One thing we've learned from MMT, and not just from MMT, is that the government actually has the U.S. government and governments all around the world have a lot more ability to run big deficits than we thought. But there are limits. And anyway, but your second question is a lot more interesting to me. So can I go with that one? So why is the Trump administration embracing crypto? It's because Trump. There are very few things that he actually believes in his gut. He believes and some of the things he believes in his gut are completely stupid and wrong. Like he believes that foreign countries pay tariffs and that money will pour into our treasury from foreigners. Okay. But another thing, he really does believe that, because he knows, because he used the dollar as a sanctions tool during his presidency, and he really does like the power of the dollar. And he also, I think in his gut, he knows that Bitcoin is ridiculous. He has said so publicly. He did. But then, guess what? You'll never guess what happened next, right? The crypto people formed PACs, right? Political action committees, funded them with all this ridiculous, this money that had been pouring into their exchanges, and they became the biggest donors in the 2024 election cycle, bigger than any other industry. And he saw this, and his people saw, and they said, "Hey, there's a real money pot here," and a lot of candidates. And it wasn't just Republicans. There were some Democrats who really, fell, who sold their souls for the crypto money too. And he gave a speech sometime, I can't remember, it was late July during the campaign, saying, I'm going to be the Bitcoin president. This is the same guy who had said, Bitcoin is a scam, Bitcoin is a fraud. Take your time, Phil. It's okay. This is my cousin I haven't seen for years. I don't want him to get hurt. That would be a real tragedy. Came to Politics and Prose, his phone went off. Oh, no. Take your time. I'm so happy to see him, and, I don't want him, It's okay. It's okay. That's okay. Everyone tell my cousin it's okay. Okay. Sorry. So back to a little more cosmic things here. So, and then, now this came after my deadline, my November 25th deadline. You remember Trump, before my deadline, his idiot sons, Donald Jr., Eric, and Barron, got into crypto. They got orange pilled, this is to use the crypto bros lingo. And they launched this crypto company. So, just, scandalous conflict of interest for them to be doing this. But anyway, they did that. And and then of course, just like, I don't know, what is it, 2 or 3 days before the inauguration, they launched a meme coin, called Trump, the Trump coin, and a Melania coin. I mean, my God, so yes, I mean, he has seen the light that crypto is another way to have a really lucrative grift, okay? And he's rewarded, people who, Peter Thiel doesn't get a position in the administration, but David Sachs, who was a big pal of all these Silicon Valley tech bros, is the crypto czar. And they clearly are, they're also going to try to change regulations at the Securities and Exchange Commission and Commodities Futures Trading Commission, all these agencies that regulated crypto, which they felt were being too tough on crypto during the Biden administration. They're going to reward their donors by loosening up these regulations. Now, look, there's a legitimate argument about what crypto regulations should be, and that's not the subject of my book. It could be a subject of another really good book. There are good books about it, even if all the things that Trump promised it was at a Bitcoin conference in July. Even if they did all those things, the status of the dollar wouldn't necessarily be affected. I think millions of Americans will lose their life savings in crypto scams because the regulation is going to get very loose. You just hate to see it, and the Trumps are going to get even filthier rich than they already are because. There's other things that the Trump family is in crypto that are, I'm not going to pull my punches here. It's scammy as hell. So that's why. Will it undermine? One of the cashiers in the back is applauding. Will it undermine the dollar? I don't know if that was your question, but as I say, it will take a lot to dethrone the dollar as the dominant currency. If it goes too far, if someday, Barron goes to Trump and says, "Dad, I'll tell you, the fiat system it's dead, and Melania says, Donald, you should believe what Barron says here. He's such a smart boy. I'm sorry, I really shouldn't, but I can't resist. But you can pick it, right? Look, the really sad thing is we can all imagine this. I hope it doesn't happen. Maybe it's ridiculous, but it could, right? Well, so, let's make Bitcoin legal tender. Let's make, Barron wants to do it. So, Dad, I'm telling you, and Trump has praised Barron to the skies. Maybe Barron is a very smart kid. I don't know. No? Okay. Thank you. My other cousin Marilyn is telling me no. Anyway, it's all conceivable, isn't it? So, anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me a question where I could really, rant about this. It's a good question.
Hi, I'll try to not be too rambling, but I'm mostly confused, and maybe you could provide guidance if there are books that you have already written or other books. But until recently, I was a program officer at the National Science Foundation, which funds theoretically based, research-based projects, that often involve developing facts and information, and obviously we have a lack of that at the current moment. So I go back to the 2008 crisis, and that's when I first, I had kids and everything, so I had plenty to do, and without worrying about economic theory. But it became clear to me that money was flying all around the world, and we have new financial instruments. Quantitative easing is a concept that I'm still trying to get a grip on. And then, like mortgage-backed securities and then iterations on that. We have these financial instruments that, are built on other ones, that build on other ones, and people invent things all the time. And then I think of about complexity, like nonlinear dynamics and the math, and you can look at predator-prey relations and the fact that economists didn't have a clue that the 2008 thing was popping up. And I'm just so confused about how to understand. I mean, I understand basic supply and demand and things like that, but we're far beyond that. And then we realize our country has made a transition from growing food and making stuff, and now so much of our economy is devoted to finance and moving money around and making money on money and that kind of thing. So is there anything I can read or about that to help me understand what's going on? I'm not expecting you to tell me now, but
Okay, well, join the club. I think we're all confused. I do have a good bit of a section in it'll be the third chapter of my book about the global financial crisis. It's a very important episode in the history of the dollar. But what I write is, that we were all expecting, and I include myself in this because I was at the Washington Post covering, I left in 2006, but before that I'd written a lot of articles saying that we need to worry about the dollar collapsing because the U.S. is running huge trade deficits. All these dollars are flooding overseas. And what actually happened in that crisis, even though it was a made in the USA crisis, it was all the misfeasance and nonfeasance and malfeasance was by America. It happened in the US, on Wall Street mostly, and yet the dollar rose at the most intense period of that crisis from April 2008 to March 2009. This is in my book. The dollar rose by 15% against an index of other currencies. Now that's really perverse, right? We caused the crisis to happen, and yet all this money came into the dollar, but it was a very revealing episode because what it showed is how in a crisis people rush to dollar assets. Specifically, what they rush to is U.S. Treasury securities, because that's a market for the safest and most liquid assets in the world. That market is like no other. In a crisis, everyone wants to be able to get cash in a hurry. Otherwise, they're the next Lehman Brothers, right? If you can't pay your bills, you're bankrupt. But they also don't want to have to sell what they own at a big fire sale price. Treasury securities it's this enormous market, and you can buy and sell large sums without causing the price to go up or down. So everyone wanted treasuries. And not only that, but everyone, not just in the United States, but all around the world, they were desperate to get their hands on dollars. And the Federal Reserve had to act as the backstop for the whole world economy by flooding the world with dollars. No other central bank could do that. The European Central Bank can create euros, the Bank of England can create pounds, the Bank of Japan can create yen. Everyone wanted dollars. The Federal Reserve had to swap its dollars for euros with the Europeans and then all these other currencies, and it backstopped the whole global economy that way. It showed that it was the central bank, not only for the United States, but in a crisis, really for the world. So that was a very important episode. And I'm not sure I'm answering your question about the financialization of the U.S. I think it's a problem, but it doesn't mean that we're going to collapse.
Well, just
Okay.
one final comment. Yeah. It just shows you, like, I remember when I was like 12 or 13 and I went to a Billy Graham rally, and they asked us to come forward if we had faith. And it seems like our economy is based a lot on faith, just faith and trust in the American dollar. And if that isn't there, then we're in big trouble.
Of course, I agree with you.
Hi. I wanted to ask, I know you talked about the concerns with cryptocurrency being the fact that it, first of all, has no backing on the US dollar and it being, just not even trustworthy. I wanted to ask about something that's up and coming, U.S. stablecoins, which are backed dollar for dollar. I could get one stablecoin, get back $1. What do you feel should be the concern, if any, about U.S. stablecoins? Do you feel like there's something that we should trust if they can be backed dollar for dollar? And two, I would also ask, what are your concerns if the U.S. doesn't take leadership in the crypto space? There's been concerns that maybe our adversaries like China or Russia will try and take leadership in shaping some of those frameworks.
I definitely don't worry about other countries taking leadership. I've been reading lately that, if we don't have a strategic Bitcoin reserves, other countries are going to buy up all the Bitcoin. Well, they're welcome to do it if they want. But stablecoins is a serious question. So let me, I get into stablecoins in the book. And, the stablecoin, the crypto industry argues that stablecoins are the way to really promote the dominance of the dollar, because stablecoins will be used all over the world, and as you say, they are, they're backed. The idea, they're not like Bitcoin. They don't go up and down minute to minute. And at one point in my research on this book, I became kind of convinced about that. Like, rather than have a central bank digital currency, right, stablecoins would be a better way of promoting the dollar. I've come around to the view that that's not the case. The Trump administration is clearly moving in that direction. The Treasury Secretary has said, we're going to go for stable coins. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but I have a lot of problems with stable coins. One of them is that if we are spreading stable coins all over the world and people are transacting with these things in Rwanda and Bangladesh and so forth. It's nice for the individuals involved, but it actually is quite bad for those countries, because they won't have control over their own money supplies. Their central banks, economists call this currency substitution, and it's a real problem. We're going to undermine their monetary sovereignty, their ability to control their own, their interest rates. Now, a lot of them lose control over that anyway. Which is one reason why people in those countries like to have dollars. But I think we're much better off in helping them, so that they can have a central bank like the Federal Reserve or like the Bank of England. So that's one of I have several other problems with stablecoins, but we're almost out of time. And there's one other guy who's been standing very patiently waiting to ask a question.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
One of the features of American economy and also other advanced economies has been a very high and rising level of public debt. So at least many theory in economics, but one is fiscal theory of price level, states that at some point something gotta give. So if public debt is rising, you would see that reflected in the value of money. You would see inflation. We saw some inflation recently. We could see more. Japan is now seeing inflation. And there are structural features of American institutions, American fiscal institutions, that makes it very hard to reduce the debt. And also you have spending on climate, on defense, you have those pressures mounting. So it is likely that public debt will rise in the US. So in your view, does this issues of public debt are they risks to US dollar dominance, and what could be done about it?
I think we ought to be very worried about the fiscal situation in the U.S. I don't think we would have. It's really very remote possibility that we would have the type of crisis that, say, Greece had or Argentina, because it's the reserve currency of the world. And people don't have to worry about a default because the Fed can always print the dollars to cover the Treasury obligations. So that takes away a lot of instability, but. Please, as you'll see, if you get as far as the last chapter of my book, I am very concerned about the U.S. Fiscal situation because the deficit, we're running deficits that are officially projected at about 6% of GDP from now over the next 10 years. It's probably more likely to be something like 10% if you really do the numbers realistically. That means that the Treasury is going to have to borrow an enormous amount of money. That's going to push up interest rates for everybody else. That'll affect the productivity of the U.S. economy, and we'll all be worse off. And that could ultimately have some deleterious effect on dollar dominance. But I don't think it's the kind of thing where, we have to worry about all of a sudden everyone will lose confidence in dollar securities. I'm not saying it's, boy, I've been writing about a lot of financial crises, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's they really surprise you. They come for causes that you hadn't really anticipated. But Brad, one more, okay.
Hi, we're at 8, so I realize this needs to be short, and it's almost identical to the previous question, but one slight angle on that is, you mentioned debt relative to GDP, so relative debt's important in the debt question, public versus private, so we can limit it to public debt here, which is what you were talking about.
Right.
How about debt, public debt relative to other countries? So if the U.S. were sort of under siege because of the S&P lowered the ratings on U.S. bonds and so forth, which they have done and are threatened to do, would the comparison between U.S. debt by any measure to other countries' debt in terms of the dominance of the dollar, how much debt is there in China, how much debt is there anywhere else, would folks stick with the dollar because in comparison to other alternatives, the debt wasn't any worse here than it was elsewhere. So.
Well, one thing we haven't mentioned, I live in Japan, which has a much higher ratio of debt to GDP than the United States. Now, there are people who are worried that Japan, someday there's going to be a big run on the yen. And like I said, if there's one thing I've learned about financial crises is don't rule out really unexpected things, bad things happening. But to reiterate what I just said to the previous questioner, I think that the risk of, some sudden, foreigners just dumping dollars and saying we don't want anything to do with it anymore, they need dollars, they need treasury securities in particular for so many things. It's so entrenched in the global financial system. They need it for hedging, they need it for collateral, for all kinds of transactions. They need it for trade. They need it for borrowing. It's unbelievably entrenched in the global financial system. And for them to just say, well, we're not going to deal with these securities anymore is, boy, really awful things would have to happen. And they'd be so awful that it wouldn't matter about dollar dominance, because that would be the least of our worries. Dollar dominance is important, but the kinds of scenarios you can imagine in which it would be lost are so awful that there are a lot of reasons why we ought to try not to have those things happen. And dollar dominance is somewhere coming down, like 5th or 6th on the list. Okay.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm seeing more familiar faces. Thanks you all for coming.